Who was Shelley Fabares, really? For an entire generation, Shelley Fabares was a symbol of youth, innocence, and Hollywood glamour. She became famous for her role as Mary Stone on the Donna Reed Show, rose to the height of the entertainment world, and later became the only actress to appear alongside Elvis Presley in all three of their films together: Girl Happy in 1965, Spin Out in 1966, and Clambake in 1967. She had beauty, she had fame, she had an unforgettable smile. And for millions of people, she became a cherished part of their memories of youth. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the final applause faded away, what was Shelley Fabares' greatest regret? What was the final wish she never had the chance to fulfill before her death? And why did that dream ultimately remain unfinished? What did Mike witness during the 22 months Shelley spent waiting for a liver transplant? 22 months filled with fear, uncertainty, and the constant possibility that her life could change at any moment. Mike Farrell eventually spoke out, revealing a deeply private secret about the woman he had loved for more than 40 years. His memories reveal a Shelley the public rarely saw, a woman who had achieved extraordinary fame, yet ultimately treasured something far more personal than the glamour of Hollywood. And perhaps even more intriguing is the love story that remained by her side through all those years. Why did Shelley choose Mike Farrell? What happened between them that turned a chance encounter into a marriage that lasted 42 years? Were they truly as happy together as the public believed? Today, we will look beyond the Hollywood spotlight, beyond Elvis Presley, beyond Johnny Angel, and beyond the smile that captivated millions, to uncover the final chapter of Shelley Fabares' extraordinary life and the 42-year love story that remained by her side until her final days. 1. A meeting that seemed to mean nothing. Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell had known each other for years before they ever became a couple. They were both actors, working in the same Hollywood world. At different times, they had both worked at Universal, and whenever they crossed paths, they would simply exchange a polite hello. That was all. There was no dramatic first encounter, no instant confession of love, no sign that these two people would one day become husband and wife and spend more than 4 decades together. At the time, Shelley Fabares was already a familiar and beloved face to American television audiences. She had grown up in front of the cameras, becoming famous as Mary Stone on the Donna Reed Show. She had also become a teenage idol and a successful recording artist, with Johnny Angel reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Mike Farrell, meanwhile, was building his own career as an actor. He would eventually become famous around the world as Captain B.J. Honeycutt on MASH. But in 1980, his life was increasingly shaped by something beyond Hollywood. He had become deeply involved in political and social justice issues. That year, Mike traveled to El Salvador, where he visited refugee camps and confronted the harsh realities of a country torn apart by conflict. The experience affected him deeply. He returned to the United States emotionally exhausted, carrying the weight of what he had seen. And almost immediately after returning from El Salvador, he traveled to San Francisco to attend a CBS affiliate dinner. The contrast was overwhelming. Only moments before, he had been surrounded by the realities of suffering and political violence. Now he was standing in a room filled with actors, listening to people talk about television, movies, and show business. Mike later recalled feeling so overwhelmed that he hardly knew whether he was going to laugh or break down. And then, across the room, he saw a familiar face, Shelley Fabares. He had seen her many times before. They had exchanged countless casual greetings over the years, but something felt different that night. Mike walked over to her. He did not flirt with her. He did not make some clever Hollywood pickup line. Instead, he said something surprisingly honest. He told Shelley that whenever he saw her, he felt good. He felt calmer than he had felt moments before. For Shelley, it was simply a sweet and unexpected compliment. But for Mike, that moment carried something deeper. She had done nothing extraordinary. She had not tried to impress him. She had simply been there. And somehow, after everything he had just experienced in El Salvador, her presence gave him a feeling of peace. Perhaps that was the first clue that there was something unusual about the connection between them. Because sometimes, love does not begin with fireworks. Sometimes it begins with a feeling of calm, a feeling that is almost impossible to explain. And perhaps the most fascinating question is this: was that evening in San Francisco simply another chance encounter between two actors who happened to know each other? Or was it the quiet beginning of a relationship that would eventually last for more than 4 decades? 2. The San Francisco cable car, the moment they truly connected. After the CBS event, Mike and Shelley had a chance to talk again. The evening could easily have ended there, with another polite goodbye between two actors who happened to work in the same industry. But Mike decided to take a chance. He asked Shelley if she would like to take a ride on one of San Francisco's famous cable cars. At first, Shelley said no. She already had plans and seemed hesitant to change them. Mike understood and did not pressure her. But then, almost as if she had suddenly changed her mind, Shelley turned back and said, "Sure, why not?" And just like that, an ordinary Hollywood evening took an unexpected turn. The two of them boarded the cable car and traveled down toward Fisherman's Wharf. For a moment, it might have looked like the beginning of a romantic date, but what happened between them was much more meaningful than a typical Hollywood love story. As they walked along the waterfront, Mike began talking about El Salvador. Only days earlier, he had been inside refugee camps, witnessing people whose lives had been shattered by violence and political conflict. Those experiences were still fresh in his mind. He talked about the people he had met, the things he had seen, and the emotions he had been carrying since returning home. This was not the kind of conversation most people would expect from a first date. There was no glamorous Hollywood gossip, no discussion about fame, no attempt to impress one another. Instead, Mike was opening up about some of the most difficult experiences of his life, and Shelley listened. She did not try to interrupt him. She did not try to turn the conversation toward herself. She simply stayed beside him, listening patiently and offering the kind of quiet support that Mike apparently needed at that moment. That simple quality may have been what made Shelley so different to him. She had spent much of her life surrounded by people who knew her as a television star. Millions knew her face, millions knew her voice. Millions remembered her as the charming young woman from the Donna Reed Show and the singer behind Johnny Angel. But on that evening in San Francisco, Mike was not looking at a celebrity. He was seeing Shelley, a woman who could sit beside him and listen without judgment, a woman who seemed to make him feel calmer simply by being there. After their walk along the waterfront, they eventually made their way back toward the hotel. The next morning they were assigned to share a car heading to the airport. Their relationship was still undefined. Neither of them knew what this evening would eventually become. There had been no dramatic confession, no promise of marriage, not even a clear declaration that they were falling in love. But something had changed. Mike had allowed Shelley to see a deeply personal side of himself, and Shelley had shown him that she could be there without asking anything in return. Perhaps that was the real beginning of their relationship, not with fame, not with glamour, not with the kind of romance Hollywood usually sells to the world, but with something much quieter: trust, understanding, and the rare feeling of being completely comfortable in another person's presence. Because sometimes, the strongest relationships do not begin with a racing heartbeat. Sometimes, they begin with the feeling that, for the first time in a long time, you can finally breathe. And for Mike Farrell, perhaps Shelley Fabares was that feeling. 3. A love story that began with a question about an ex. How could a marriage that lasted more than 4 decades begin with such an ordinary question? How are things going with your boyfriend? After their evening together in San Francisco, Mike Farrell and Shelley Fabares remained in contact. There was still no official romance between them. They were simply two people who had discovered that they enjoyed talking to each other. Mike was also continuing his work related to El Salvador. Sometime later, he was invited to give another presentation about his experiences there, and he decided to invite Shelley. The first time she could not make it, but Shelley did something that caught Mike's attention. A few months later, when Mike was invited to speak about El Salvador again, Shelley contacted him and asked if it would be all right if she brought her sister. Of course, Mike said yes. Shelley and her sister attended the presentation, and afterward, Mike and Shelley went out for coffee. It was a simple meeting. No cameras, no red carpets, no Hollywood photographers waiting outside. Just two people sitting together and talking. During their conversation, Mike remembered something Shelley had mentioned during their earlier trip. At the time, she had been working on One Day at a Time and had talked about a problem she was having with the show's writers. So Mike casually asked her whether she had ever managed to resolve that problem. He was expecting an answer about her work. Instead, Shelley gave him an answer that changed the direction of their relationship. She told him that she and her boyfriend were no longer seeing each other. For Mike, the moment came almost unexpectedly. He later recalled the story with humor, remembering how Shelley was apparently playing with a fake fingernail when she gave him the news. It was not some dramatic Hollywood confession. There was no romantic music playing in the background, no carefully planned proposal. Just a casual conversation between two people who were beginning to become important to each other. But that simple sentence changed everything. For the first time, Mike knew that Shelley was no longer in that relationship, and perhaps, for the first time, the possibility of something more between them became real. What makes this story so fascinating is how ordinary the beginning was. Shelley was already a famous actress. Mike was building a major career of his own. Both had experienced relationships before, and neither was looking at the other as some mysterious stranger. They were adults who had slowly developed trust. They had talked, they had listened, they had shared personal experiences, and somewhere along the way, friendship began turning into something deeper. Mike did not need a grand romantic gesture to fall for Shelley. Perhaps what drew him closer was the same thing he had noticed that first night in San Francisco. She made him feel calm. She listened. She understood. And Shelley, in turn, seemed comfortable enough around Mike to share the more personal parts of her life. That may have been the moment when their relationship quietly crossed a line. They were no longer simply two actors who happened to know each other. They were becoming two people who wanted to spend more time together. And neither of them could have known just how far that simple connection would eventually take them. Because from that seemingly ordinary conversation over coffee would grow a relationship that survived the pressures of Hollywood, the demands of two careers, and the most frightening health crisis of Shelley's life. A relationship that would eventually become a marriage, lasting more than 40 years. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this. Their love story did not begin with a grand declaration. It began with a question about an ex, and a very unexpected answer. 1984. Two Hollywood stars decide to get married. By the time Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell decided to marry, neither of them was a newcomer to Hollywood. Shelley had already lived an extraordinary life in front of the cameras. She had become a household name as Mary Stone on the Donna Reed Show, growing up before millions of television viewers. She had also experienced the unexpected success of her singing career, with Johnny Angel becoming a #1 hit and turning her into one of the most recognizable young stars of her generation. And then there was Elvis Presley. Shelley had appeared alongside the king of rock and roll in 3 films, Girl Happy, Spin Out, and Clam Bake, making her one of the actresses most closely associated with Elvis's Hollywood years. By the time she met Mike Farrell again in a more meaningful way, Shelley was no longer simply the charming young actress America had watched grow up. She was an established star who had already experienced the highs and lows of fame. Mike Farrell had built a successful career of his own. His breakthrough came with MASH, where he played Captain B.J. Honeycutt, a character who would become one of the most beloved figures in the series. Unlike many Hollywood couples, they were not two young people rushing into their first serious relationship. Both had already lived through previous relationships, both understood what fame could bring and what it could take away. Perhaps that experience helped them approach their relationship differently. They had not fallen in love simply because they were two attractive actors working in Hollywood. Their connection had developed slowly. First came familiarity, then friendship, then trust, and eventually something much deeper. In 1984, Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell decided to get married. Their wedding took place in the garden of Shelley's famous aunt, Nanette Fabares. It was a fitting setting for Shelley. Show business had always been part of her family. Nanette Fabares was a celebrated actress, singer, and dancer, a major figure from Hollywood's golden era. And now, in that family garden, Shelley was beginning a completely different chapter of her own life. She was no longer simply the teenage girl from the Donna Reed Show. She was no longer just the singer behind Johnny Angel. She was no longer simply the actress who had appeared beside Elvis Presley. She was becoming a wife. And Mike Farrell was becoming the man who would share the next chapter of her life. At that moment, neither of them could have known just how long that chapter would last. Hollywood had seen countless famous couples fall in love, marry, and then quietly separate only a few years later. Fame could bring people together, but it could also place enormous pressure on a marriage. Yet Shelley and Mike were about to begin something very different. Their relationship would survive changing careers, changing priorities, illness, uncertainty, and the passage of time. More than 4 decades would pass. And through all those years, the two people who had once simply exchanged polite hellos would remain husband and wife. But what would happen when Hollywood glamour disappeared and real life began testing their marriage? Would the love that began with a chance connection in San Francisco be strong enough to survive the hardest years still waiting ahead? That was the question neither Shelley nor Mike could answer in 1984. But life would soon give them the answer. By the time Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell were married, both of them already knew what it meant to live under the spotlight. They were not ordinary couples. They were both successful actors, recognized by millions of television viewers. Shelley had grown up in front of America as Mary Stone on the Donna Reed Show, later becoming a successful singer and actress. Mike had built his own reputation, especially through his role as Captain B.J. Honeycutt on MASH. Yet somehow, their marriage never seemed to become another Hollywood production. They did not appear to be competing over who was more famous. They did not need to prove that they were Hollywood's perfect power couple. Instead, they continued to build their careers separately while quietly supporting one another. Shelley continued acting, eventually taking on one of the most important roles of her later career, as Christine Armstrong on Coach. Mike continued working as an actor as well, while also devoting considerable time to political and social causes that mattered deeply to him. Their professional lives were different, their interests were different, their personalities were different. But perhaps that was part of what made their marriage work. They did not seem to need each other to become more famous. They simply needed each other to become better versions of themselves. One of the sweetest examples came during Shelley's years on Coach. Mike would sometimes go to the studio to watch her work. He would sit among the audience while the show was being taped, quietly watching his wife perform. Think about that image for a moment. Shelley was the one standing under the lights. She was the actress everyone in the studio had come to watch. The audience laughed at her lines and followed her performance, and somewhere among those viewers sat her husband. He wasn't trying to steal the spotlight. He wasn't trying to become part of the scene. He was simply there to support her. Sometimes he would even clap a little louder. It was a small gesture, but it revealed something important about their relationship. Mike did not need to stand beside Shelley under the lights to be part of her success. He was perfectly comfortable sitting in the audience, watching the woman he loved shine. And perhaps Shelley appreciated that more than anyone, because she had spent most of her life being watched. From childhood, cameras had followed her. Millions of people knew her face. Millions had opinions about her career, her appearance, and her performances. But at home, she did not need another audience. She needed someone who could simply be her husband, someone who could see Shelley Fabares, rather than the Hollywood star Shelley Fabares. And Mike seemed to understand that distinction. Their marriage was not built around constant public appearances or proving how happy they were. It was built around small moments of support, showing up, listening, giving each other room to be themselves, and being there when the other person needed someone beside them. Perhaps that is the real secret behind their extraordinary marriage. They were both famous, but their relationship was never about fame. They were both successful, but they did not need to compete. They lived in Hollywood, but they did not allow Hollywood to define their marriage. Instead of trying to become the perfect Hollywood couple, Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell seemed to choose something much simpler. They tried to be good partners to each other. And as the years passed, that quiet decision would become more important than either of them could have imagined. Because eventually, their marriage would face a challenge far greater than fame, careers, or public attention. It would face something neither of them could simply walk away from: illness, and that would reveal just how strong their partnership truly was. 6. The greatest test: liver disease and the long wait for a transplant. For Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell, the hardest chapter of their marriage did not begin with a disagreement, a career crisis, or the pressures of Hollywood. It began with illness. Shelley developed serious liver problems, and suddenly, the life they had built together changed completely. The glamorous world they knew seemed to disappear. There were no red carpets to attend, no television cameras, no premieres, no applause. Instead, there were hospital visits, medical appointments, uncertainty, and the constant question of whether a suitable donor would become available in time. During those frightening months, Shelley and Mike carried medical pagers with them, waiting for the call that could change everything. The pager could go off at any moment, and every time it did, their hearts must have raced with the same terrifying hope. Could this finally be the call? Could there finally be a liver? But not every call brought good news. There were moments when they were awakened by messages that made them believe a donor organ might finally be available, only to discover that the information was mistaken or that the opportunity had disappeared. Then they had to return to waiting. And waiting became part of their lives. For Shelley, the uncertainty was frightening. For Mike, there was nothing he could do to make the illness disappear. He could not act his way out of it. He could not negotiate with it. He could not use his fame to change the outcome. All he could do was stay beside his wife, and that may have been the most important thing he could give her. During those long months, their marriage was no longer about two successful actors. They were simply a husband and wife waiting for a second chance at life. Then, in October 2000, the call they had been waiting for finally came. A suitable donor liver had become available. Shelley underwent a liver transplant. The surgery was successful, but that did not mean the struggle was suddenly over. Recovery took time. Her body had to adjust. Her strength had to return. And emotionally, there were battles that Shelley did not expect. After the physical healing had progressed, she later experienced a period of deep depression. In some ways, this was difficult for her to understand. She had survived. She had been given another chance at life. So why did she still feel so emotionally overwhelmed? Only later did she begin to understand that her body had spent so much energy simply surviving and healing that the emotions she had pushed aside could finally emerge. The fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty. All of it had been waiting beneath the surface, and once again Mike was there. Not as a famous actor, not as the man millions of people knew from MASH, but simply as her husband. He stayed beside Shelley through the uncertainty, the recovery, and the emotional aftermath. This was the moment when their marriage faced its greatest test. Because when everything is going well, love can be easy to talk about. But illness strips away almost everything else. It removes the spotlight. It removes the glamour. It removes the illusion that fame can protect anyone from suffering. What remains is much simpler: a wife fighting to recover, and a husband choosing to stay beside her. For Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell, those years revealed something that no red carpet ever could. Their marriage was not built only on attraction, fame, or shared success. It had been built on presence, on patience, on simply being there when the other person needed someone most. And perhaps that was why, after more than 4 decades together, Shelley would remember Mike not for the role he played on television, but for the role he played in her real life. He was the person who stayed. And when the darkest chapter finally began to pass, Shelley still had another emotional journey ahead, one that would teach her that surviving and truly living are not always the same thing. 7. The pink hair, the little story that revealed how Mike loved the real Shelley during the darkest period of her illness. Shelley Fabares decided to do something she had rarely allowed herself to do. She decided to stop worrying about what other people thought. For most of her life, Shelley had been expected to look a certain way. She had entered show business as a child. She had grown up in front of cameras. Millions of people knew her as the beautiful young actress with the sweet smile and carefully maintained image. There had always been expectations: how she should look, how she should behave, what was appropriate for a television star. But while she was fighting serious illness, something inside Shelley began to change. She started to realize that life was too fragile to spend every moment worrying about rules that other people had created for her. One afternoon, while sitting in a hair salon, Shelley noticed another woman with dramatically dyed, spiky pink hair. She loved it, and suddenly she wanted the same thing, so she asked her stylist to give her a bold, bright pink hairstyle. For someone who had spent almost her entire life protecting a public image, it was an unusually rebellious choice. But for Shelley, it represented something much bigger: freedom. She had spent decades being told, directly or indirectly, what she could and could not do. Now she was facing a serious illness, and she began asking herself a simple question: if not now, then when? She decided that she no longer wanted to live entirely according to other people's expectations. She wanted to enjoy whatever moments she had. She wanted to be herself. And so, Shelley walked out of the salon with bright pink hair. But then came the moment that mattered even more. She had to show her husband. What would Mike Farrell think? Would the man known for his calm and conservative style be shocked? Would he tell her that she had gone too far? Would he prefer the old Shelley, the familiar television star with the carefully polished appearance? Apparently none of those things happened. Mike loved it. Instead of criticizing her, he encouraged her. In fact, Shelley later recalled that he would encourage her to do it again whenever the color began to fade. It may sound like a tiny story, just a woman getting an unusual haircut, just a husband telling his wife that he liked it. But perhaps that is exactly why the story is so powerful. Because Mike was not in love with an image. He was not trying to preserve the Shelley Fabares that millions of television viewers remembered. He loved the woman behind that image. The woman who could be elegant one day and wildly pink-haired the next. The woman who could be vulnerable, frightened, playful, stubborn, or completely spontaneous. He accepted all of her, and Shelley seemed to know that. Perhaps after spending a lifetime being watched and judged by the public, there was something incredibly comforting about having one person who never asked her to perform. She did not have to be Mary Stone. She did not have to be the singer behind Johnny Angel. She did not have to be the glamorous Hollywood actress. She could simply be Shelley. And Mike could simply love her. That little story about the pink hair may therefore reveal more about their marriage than any photograph from a red carpet ever could. Because sometimes, love is not proven through grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes, it is simply the person beside you saying, "I like you exactly as you are." And perhaps it was these quiet moments, rather than the fame, the success, or the Hollywood glamour, that helped explain how Shelley Fabares and Mike Farrell remained together for more than 4 decades. 8. Her final regret. If only I could tell him one more time. After more than 4 decades together, Shelley Fabares had experienced almost every chapter a life could offer. She had known fame as a child. She had become a teenage idol. She had stood beside Elvis Presley on the big screen. She had heard millions of people sing along to Johnny Angel. She had experienced marriage, divorce, success, illness, fear, recovery, and a second chance at life. But there was one moment that revealed what mattered most to her. During one of the most frightening periods of her life, Shelley described what she believed was an out-of-body experience. She felt as though she was beginning to leave this world. And strangely, what she experienced was not the fear she might have expected. There was no thought of Hollywood, no thought of fame, no thought of money. She was not thinking about the movies she had made, the songs she had recorded, or the millions of people who had watched her on television. Instead, her thoughts turned to the people she loved, and one person stood above all the rest: Mike Farrell. She remembered wishing that she could somehow tell him one more time that she loved him, that she was grateful for him, that she wanted him to know just how much his presence had meant throughout her life. Think about that for a moment. A woman who had spent almost her entire life surrounded by cameras and applause was not thinking about the audience when she believed she was approaching the end. She was thinking about her husband, the man who had been there when the cameras were gone, the man who had sat beside her through uncertainty, the man who had watched her fight through illness, the man who had accepted her when she was vulnerable, frightened, or simply wanted to walk into a salon and come out with bright pink hair. That experience seemed to change something inside Shelley. She said that the feeling of peace stayed with her for years, and perhaps it also gave her a different understanding of what truly mattered. Because when a person looks back at an entire lifetime, the things that once seemed enormous can suddenly become very small. The awards, the television appearances, the movie sets, the fame, the attention, all of it eventually fades. But the people who stayed beside you remain. For Shelley, that person was Mike. Their love story had not begun with a spectacular Hollywood romance. It began quietly. Two actors who already knew each other, a chance encounter in San Francisco, a cable car ride, a long conversation by the water, a question about an ex-boyfriend. And then, slowly, a relationship that became a marriage. More than 40 years later, that ordinary beginning had become something extraordinary. Shelley Fabares had spent a lifetime being remembered by millions of people. But perhaps the most important person in her life was not one of those millions. It was the man who knew the woman behind the famous face, the man who knew Shelley when she was not Mary Stone. Not an actress, not a singer, not an icon, just Shelley. And maybe that is the most beautiful ending to their story. After all the fame she achieved, the person she most wanted to thank was the person who had simply stayed. After all the applause, she wanted one more private moment. After all the roles she had played, she wanted to speak as herself. And perhaps her greatest regret was not leaving behind another movie, another song, or another performance. It was simply wishing she had one more chance to say, "I love you. Thank you for being there." Because in the end, Shelley Fabares' greatest legacy may not be the character she played on television, the songs she recorded, or even the films she made with Elvis Presley. It may be something much quieter. A reminder that behind every famous face is a human life. And when the lights finally go out, what remains is not the applause, it is love. And for Shelley Fabares, that love had a name: Mike Farrell.